Welcome to Retro Groove. Enjoy your voyage. Retro Groove. Retro Groove. Retro Groove. Retro
Howdy, and welcome to Retro Groove. I'm Adam,
And I'm Liam.
and this is a podcast where we talk about music that stands the test of time. Welcome to episode 3 of Retro Groove Season 2, as we are starting to wrap up summer and get into fall. Liam, how have things been going with you?
Pretty good. I went to see Rage Against the Machine and Run the Jewels.
And Run the Jewels.
And it was
amazing.
It was awesome.
Ah.
I didn't spoil it for myself in advance to look at the set list.
Okay.
And which is a good thing. A couple weird things though. So one, because I didn't look into the show at all, I went in cold. I didn't realize that Zach, I think he tore his Achilles tendon or something like that.
Oh.
And so he had to sit the entire time, which was bizarre. It was still really cool and it had its own kind of sense of impact, but there was this weirdness of like you didn't get him jumping around and getting in your face from the stage. It was
his stage energy is kind of the whole part of the thing.
Yeah, but it let kind of Tim and Tom do their thing and kind of stand out. And it's funny, I definitely, in watching even live videos or music videos or whatever of Tom Morello's playing, it's impressive, but it just kind of doesn't seem real. And then when you experience it firsthand and he's actually just playing with his teeth and he's making these sounds with the switch on his guitar, and I'm like, this man is a magician.
Bonkers.
He's an actual
insane.
magician. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the energy was great. Set was great. And Run the Jewels, I thought were fantastic. The group that I was with weren't really familiar with them. So it was a lot of me standing up, just every word to every song, and them kind of sitting there being like, wow, you really like this band a lot, don't you?
See, that would be me. I'm a huge Rage Against the Machine fan, but I would be more excited for Run the Jewels at this point.
It was so cool. But the thing is, so it was like a bit of a residency. They were doing 4 or 5 shows at the Garden, and I went to the second one. And 2 things about the Run the Jewels set. First, they didn't do Call Ticketron, which is the one where they say Run the Jewels live at the Garden.
Come on, you're at the Garden.
Do that. I looked it up, and they did it the first night when they came out of the thing.
Oh, that makes sense.
And the other thing, dude, is they Zach, I guess because of his injury, didn't come out. They did the songs that he features on, and I'm like, I know he's here. He's backstage.
Yeah, he's got to be around here somewhere.
And that's when I found out about his injury, because then I start Googling. I'm like, man, they just did the second song that he does, and he didn't come out. And I'm a little crestfallen. And I'm looking at the set list, and then I click the Rage set list, and it's like, oh, he's busted his leg. He can't come out. But apparently, and they didn't do this the night I went, but apparently Rage has been bringing Run the Jewels out for the song from RTJ2, Close Your Eyes.
Oh, wow.
And so Run the Jewels on certain nights come out and perform that song with Rage, which
that's nuts.
Oh man, I'm bummed I didn't see that.
Yeah, of course you missed that one. Dang it.
But they're only doing it a handful of shows. But yeah, no, it was great. It was cool to see that band again. Got some cool merch. I got a tour poster live at the Garden. And yeah, it was pretty awesome.
Really
How are
cool.
you doing
Really
winding
cool.
down your summer?
We're doing pretty good, starting to get into the school year. You're way ahead of me in the concert going fair, but I have that Weird Al and Emo Phillips coming up in October. There have been a couple of things that I've been kind of, I should probably try to go see that, but I've just been so busy with, summertime, kids being out of school, and so much work. It's just been impossible to try to schedule something like that. But fall is coming, and that means school and being outside more. In Texas, especially as it's been with the ridiculous heat wave. We kind of had a cold front and some rain come through, and it felt amazing for it to just drop below 90. Like it was a nice little feeling of things to come, thankfully. And hopefully, this is kind of a one-off and this doesn't become the norm of just blazing hot, drought-ridden summers. My lawn looks like, a field of potato chips. It's just dead.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Hopefully the grass will spring back. But yes, listening to so much music in preparation for today's episode. Super excited to get into it because it's such a nostalgic thing. And we're going to get into our individual top 5 music or movie soundtracks from the 90s. And we're going to hash it out together and come up with our Retro Groove High Five. And we'll see how it stacks up, and we'll see what everybody has to say about it. Everyone's got strong opinions, and this was like the biggest response that we've ever had to our community questions. We had a lot of opinions and a lot of great ideas. So we'll see how everything shakes out.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like going and listening to the music, and that's not actually the easiest thing to do in this case either, is it? Because the licensing and collection of this, like when you go and look these things up on certain streaming platforms, it's not just easily there. You kind of have to go find someone's janky playlist in some of these.
Exactly.
The nature of these, like the business behind some of these things, there's like 5 or 6 parties that all have to come together when you get into music licensing for a soundtrack or film. And a lot of times it just doesn't work out. And to think that we're talking about the 90s, like stuff wasn't dialed in for a streaming platform or even any sort of digital sales, then it was like, we're going to press a bunch of CDs and maybe cassettes, and that's going to be it.
That's it.
And so it's part of the reason why you also don't see as many represses of vinyl for this kind of stuff too, because the amount of legwork you need to go through to relicense this music for this packaging, unless the legal language was kind of bulletproof, you can't see it. And it does flag something, just like the FOMO in me when I see a cool soundtrack. Like for Record Store Day, there'll usually be 1 or 2 like really unique soundtrack pieces. I always kind of go like, I feel like I need to snag this because like this is, you don't know if this is, you might
like, never see it again.
Like it just might not happen again.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a part of it that you don't really think about. It's just kind of in the background, but it affects how you're able to listen to stuff. And that's just another reason why there are some definite pros to the physical media thing, because you don't know what's going to be available to stream one day and then not the next. We're seeing that there's a big controversy about that right now in the TV world, which we won't really get into here, but it could happen. Ownership could change and they could just pull your favorite band's stuff off of all the streaming platforms just because they feel like it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, it's crazy.
We've talked about Daria, I think, before. Like that was the big one for me. Like the music of Daria was such an important part of that show. And then when you went and rewatched it, it was still a great show, but it lost a little of the punch because like they had to remake it with new music to kind of fit the scene. It just wasn't the same kind of feel.
Right. So we won't get too into it's an important part of it and an interesting part of it, but we're going to keep it fun today, keep it lighthearted. I was mentioning earlier how, especially when you're kind of younger and have more free time, summer, at least for me, was huge for movie going. There was always the summer blockbusters, and there was the free time of not being in school. And, after a while, you just are cooped up in the house too much. You want to get away from your family for a little bit. So, in the 90s, you'd hop on your bike and go with your friends down to the movie theater and pay for one movie and see two or three.
Yeah.
That's what you did.
Yeah.
So, and the movie soundtracks ended up being a huge part of that experience. They just, for some reason, the 90s really seem to stand out when it comes to maybe it was just the films that were being made at the time. Alternative was the new biggest thing ever, and it just fit so well with the narrative of so many different movies, different types of movies. So I thought this was a good time of the year to talk about these movie soundtracks. And we each have our own individual top 5. Mine, I don't know about you, I had a really hard time with this.
I feel like there are so many options here that it's going to be tough. Also, I feel like there's a whole section, and I'm going to guess that you picked a couple of the soundtracks that are legitimately amazing and cool and have great music on them. And then they're going to be put up against my cornball, like pop centric, like super cheesy, but ultimately like catchy blockbusters. Like, I feel like we're going to have to find a compromise here, but maybe I'm off. Maybe I'm off. I just, knowing like you have a very like refined taste for music. Like, I feel like you're very insightful and you like cool, like you like
being
cool,
very kind. I don't know about that.
And I like a mega jam, like I'm a sucker for it. So we're going to see. I will say on your 90s point though, there's one interesting thing that I think it all kind of plays into. You look at A Perfect Storm. So you have like the 70s into the 80s where you start having music supervisors get hired for film. Instead of just compositions being written, they're starting to see the fact that if you have a mega hit that is part of your film or is tethered to your film, it is invaluable marketing, especially like if it plays within the movie. And that, I think you pair that with the sort of pinnacle of music consumerism, of sales of music. You had your NSYNCs, your New Kids, your Backstreet Boys, your Spice Girls. Like the 90s was the peak of people going and buying expensive CDs to get a song or two, Yes. And I think like you're right. You had these big movie blockbusters. It was as big as it could get. You had people shelling out huge cash, and it was a huge marketing thing. Like everything, the planets aligned in the 90s, and you still see it today. They just did that Minions movie, and you had like Tame Impala and Diana Ross and Jack Antonoff curated the whole thing, and like still happens. What's the Happy, and there's like the Can't Fight the Feeling, the Justin Timberlake song. Like you still have these mega songs. It's still a marketing vehicle for sure. When it comes to like going out and buying a soundtrack, that was wholly a 90s, like 80s into early 2000s, sure, but it was a wholly a 90s thing. It was a big 90s thing.
I definitely agree. And, like you said, you still see it. It happens. It seems to be more of a kids movie thing now. Not that kids movies can't be great. I mean, I've mentioned it plenty of times. That Trolls World Tour soundtrack is outstanding. There's just so much good stuff on there. But yeah, the like young adult and, alternative crowd movie thing with the soundtrack to go along with it, or like the crazy comedy with all of the incredible songs on the soundtrack for whatever reason, one reason or another, because it's in a little montage for 12 seconds in the movie.
Right.
That is very, very much a 90s thing. So I agree with you on that 100%.
So do we want to like kind of delve into some maybe some stuff that's not on our lists? Like you want to touch on some of that stuff? What do you think?
Yeah, we can do that first. There's a lot that we can talk about here, and you know, there's something to be said for leaving the honorable mentions for the end, but I think with so much to cover here, I don't want us to feel like we're trying to rush through our decision making process when it really comes down to it, and we can kind of come to a crescendo. So maybe we can talk about our community question answers that we got, and
let's do that.
Our honorable mentions before we dive in. Might be a little bit of an experiment, but we're pretty loosey goosey on this show.
Let's do it.
It's all in good fun.
Well, so Dan had posted something about Man on the Moon, which it's not a soundtrack. It's not a soundtrack that I'm actually that super familiar with, and I love REM, so I know that song, but I don't know anything else about that soundtrack. I mean, Jim Carrey. It's a cool movie. I've definitely seen it. I like Andy Kaufman, but when I looked at the lineup here, I mean, it's kind of all over the place. Like it had the theme to Taxi, basically, which I love. Bob James. It had Bob James. It was a bunch of REM.
Tons of REM.
I don't know the background of how this all came together. Like I'm sure that there's a really cool kind of story to all of it, but it seems almost textural to the movie itself, as opposed to like almost a marketing vehicle for the movie. It's got the Mighty Mouse theme on it, you know, like this, and like I'm assuming the Taxi theme's on there because Andy was on Taxi, you know. So it seems like almost an audio version of the movie. Like you could follow along with it, and it tells the story of Andy Kaufman's life in this film.
Yeah, I mean, REM actually wrote the soundtrack, which is pretty awesome.
Wow.
You know, and obviously Man on the Moon was written in honor of Andy Kaufman. So it only makes sense that they would be pulled in to help provide the soundtrack. They released, as far as I know, I think The Great Beyond was written for the film, and that's actually one of their highest charting singles. It is their number one highest charting single in the UK.
Way. Wow.
Yeah. So it's almost like its own REM album almost. Mm-hmm. So definitely worth mentioning. Great addition to the discussion here. And yeah, it's one of those that I feel silly for forgetting about.
Yeah.
In hindsight.
John had shouted out the City of Angels soundtrack, which is fun. Yep. I'm assuming that's not on your list, right?
It's not on my list. No.
Okay, cool. So, because the City of Angels soundtrack is one of many that I think we're going to touch on, where you do have a bunch of artists that are very indicative of the time. You have Alanis Morissette and Paula Cole, Sarah McLachlan, and then you have that banger, man. Like you have Iris, which was such a huge song. Like you couldn't go anywhere without hearing that Goo Goo Dolls song.
Right.
And that song is, like I said, like many others that we'll talk about, was created for this and was such a huge part of this movie. It was such a huge part of the marketing for this movie, and so synonymous with it, but got so huge that they put it on Dizzy Up the Girl. Like it was included on the album that then came out after that. But definitely one worth mentioning. I've never, as again with a lot of these, I have never seen the movie. That's going to be a recurring theme here. I'm just
that's
bad
okay.
with film.
But you can enjoy the soundtrack no
Yeah.
matter whether you've seen the film or not.
And I like that's Meg Ryan, right? I think she's in that. Yeah, Meg Ryan. I like Meg Ryan a lot. Yeah, she's great.
Yes,
so
and
I should see City of Angels.
I can't remember if I've mentioned this on the show before, but Meg Ryan's dad was one of my high school math teachers.
Shut up! That's amazing.
Isn't that wild? Yep.
Wow.
That's crazy.
Also,
we didn't believe him at first. We thought he was just crazy.
Yeah, and then he's like, "No, here's a picture of my daughter."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Real deal.
I think she's still married to John Cougar Mellencamp. I think he's just John Mellencamp. I think the Cougar's gone. But yeah, like as of a few years ago, was married to John Mellencamp, which
the Cougar was never going to stick.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, I'd insert like Panther into my name if I could. It's just, like no one would buy it. But yeah, so Meg Ryan's great. I should see this movie. I like Nicolas Cage too. It seems like a cool film.
Oh yeah.
So I'll put this on my list of things that I should watch.
It's been a really long time for me. It's probably on the must rewatch list.
Yeah.
Spider-Sham brought up a really good one in The Virgin Suicides, and incredible movie. Actually, most people think of Lost in Translation, but this is actually Sofia Coppola's first feature film.
Mm-hmm.
And Air, the French kind of jazzy electronic duo, did the score / soundtrack. There's also a lot of 70s era music on there, but really obviously depressing but interesting film, and a slightly depressing but interesting soundtrack. So really good stuff on there. That was a really good
you did the whole soundtrack?
They did an original score for the film. Yeah.
Cool.
So there's all the Air tracks and instrumentals and stuff like that. That's all done by Air. That's a really, really cool. And then there was like another soundtrack that had like Boston, Heart, Al Green, Styx, you know what I mean? All of the 70s era music that was in the film, because it's when it takes place. But yeah, both aspects of it, both like the soundtrack with the existing artists, and there's also a bunch of tracks by Sloan, the group Sloan. So there's like 4 or 5 songs by them. So it's kind of an interesting hodgepodge, but it really works for what the filmmakers were going for, with the kind of the boredom and the adolescent suburban feels, you know what I mean? So they did a good job with it for sure. And then he brings up the Batman Forever soundtrack too.
Yeah, we're gonna have to hold on that one.
On that one, and he mentioned Wayne's World, which is another one that we're gonna have to probably talk about.
Okay, cool.
But who else on here?
Well, so Eric Plunk mentioned a couple things, but he one of the ones was the Brady Bunch movie, which again
I know nothing about.
What is this? And then I looked up the soundtrack, and I'm sure Davy Jones is on it, so you've already kind of won me as a Monkees fan. So I'm kind of on board. But soundtrack looks very odd, so I feel like I don't know enough to get into what the story is here, other than maybe if you really liked the movie, then it was like a really cool companion piece. I don't see any hits off of it, but the Brady Bunch is by nature a very musically oriented, there was a catchy theme song and stuff, and there was some songs that were sung, so it's no Partridge Family, but
I remember way more about the Partridge Family than the Brady Bunch, but
I was more Partridge Family than Brady Bunch too.
And wow, that's a whole nother rabbit trail we could go down. But I don't know much about the Brady Bunch movie.
We got into some Tarantino talk. I'm going to
Yep.
assume there's some Tarantino somewhere on your list.
Yeah,
So
and like I mentioned, it's almost cheating. I said this
yeah,
when Seth brought it up in the Discord. It's like, oh man, like his sound, because his soundtracks are so expertly curated,
yeah.
and it's almost cheating.
Well, and there's something interesting there too. So obviously, like he's very hands-on with his like how his films are kind of crafted, right?
Right.
And I'm assuming you and most of the people listening here are familiar with the name Ricky Rachtman, which you didn't think was going to come up in this conversation here. He's former MTV host, Headbangers Ball, The Cat House, like just a TV personality guy. We're not talking about Ricky Rachtman. We're talking about his sister. We're going to talk about Karen Rachtman. Do you know who Karen Rachtman is?
I don't, but I cannot wait for this.
Other than Ricky Rachtman's sister.
No.
Karen Rachtman, while Ricky was doing his MTV thing, was kind of like, she dropped out of high school. She was working in LA at a clothing store and started just meeting people, got introduced to Quentin Tarantino, who was working on Reservoir Dogs.
Nice.
And she had kind of learned from a handful of things that she was doing through a small film company, how to clear music, like how to negotiate music rights. And when he heard that she could do this like young upstart lady and this guy who's making his first movie, they kind of clicked. And dude, she goes on to be the music supervisor. And I'm just going to run through a few here because I think we're going to touch on some.
Okay.
So she is the music supervisor for Reservoir Dogs. All right. Pulp Fiction. Reality Bites.
Oh, wow.
Clueless. Romeo and Juliet. Boogie Nights. Bullworth. I mean, Moulin Rouge. She goes on to be one of the most impactful, like, music curators of film of the 90s. It is crazy.
A bunch of those movies that you mentioned are almost more remembered nowadays for their soundtrack than anything else, than the movie itself.
Yeah,
that's
100%.
Insane.
Yeah. So she thinks Reality Bites is one. I don't know if that's on your list, but like
wait and see.
Yeah, but like some of these are just the biggest soundtracks of the 90s, and they all have this common thread of this one lady who just had an ear for these projects.
Well, Romeo and Juliet, I don't know if it's on your list. It's definitely worth mentioning. Lady Z in the Discord brought it up along with the Crow soundtrack.
Yes, I don't know
that was another one that I was like, oh, I should have thought of that. But so I could put that on as one of my honorable mentions for sure.
Tim mentioned Run Lola Run.
Yes, that was the next thing I was going to bring up.
I think I've seen Run Lola Run, but I don't know the soundtrack very well. But I looked through it a bit and it looks pretty cool. I feel like I got to spend some time with it. But it seems like it's very connected to the actual film itself and not that sort of marketing piece, collective hit song, whatnot.
Yeah, I haven't seen it since, probably 99 or 2000. But I remember really, really liking it, and the music was great. I don't think I've ever sat down and listened to the soundtrack. But the music is a huge part of that experience for sure. And then maybe the last one, unless there's another one that you wanted to bring up here, is the Spawn soundtrack.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting one. So Spawn and it's kind of sister soundtrack, if you will, which comes out a couple years later for Blade 2, do this unique thing where they blend, just like everybody else was, I guess, at the time, although Immortal Records was the purveyor of it, right? They helped break Korn and 30 Seconds to Mars and Incubus, like that rap rock amalgam sound. Immortal Records was at the core of it. But what you have on these two soundtracks specifically, Blade 2 is a couple years later. Although I will point out, just has to be said, at least from my standpoint, Spawn, right? Comic book, like African American fronted comic book hero, 97. Blade, same time,
Right,
African American fronted like comic book. So it's like cool that these these alt comic films that, I mean, Spawn didn't do so great. Blade was pretty popular.
Yeah, Blade
had these very like almost progressive soundtracks where they were fusing Marilyn Manson and Butthole Surfers and Metallica and Filter with these EDM DJs. And
right.
they both of them were very successful soundtracks. They were really cool if you're into that kind of thing or you're open to that kind of thing. We were joking in the Discord that that's a very much a John thing. There's, certain people
that's right up his alley.
Yeah. But no, it's very, very cool soundtrack. A couple songs on there that that stood out for sure.
Nice. Yeah, Spawn was like, I feel like Spawn was very, very like we talk about comic book movies and it's like that's all that there is anymore is superhero movies. But Spawn, even back when, back then Spider-Man was popular and there was other, X-Men and stuff like that, but Spawn was always still very, very niche in the comic book world. Like only like the geekiest comic book geeks were into Spawn. I had like one friend who was a super into Spawn fan and had all the like action figures and stuff like that. But like nobody else even knew what it was. So it doesn't surprise me that the movie didn't do that well. But and unfortunately, because the soundtrack seems like such a cool experiment, and that kind of thing could have done a lot better if it was attached to a movie that more people had seen or cared to see.
Yeah, I think they identified their demographic, right? They did the market research, and there's going to be there's another one that'll be on my list here that's going to overlap this kind of sentiment a little bit. But they did their market research on it, and they were like, these are the kind of people who are going to see this movie, and these are the kind of people who want to hear this kind of music, and they should go hand in hand. Let's get the biggest names and this big franchise and really make it the thing. And it's the film kind of bombed, right? And the soundtrack had its fan base. There were a couple things that came off of that were pretty big. I don't know if you can say the soundtrack was bigger than the movie. I think they both just found their niche fandoms. That won't be the case for some of these other things where the soundtrack is much more fondly remembered than the movie is.
Yeah. So then do you have any honorable mentions that we haven't talked about yet that didn't make your top 5?
I mean, Titanic isn't on there. My wife probably wishes that it was. Like that song was such a mega hit. That was such a crazy thing.
It's everywhere.
And Celine Dion had a bunch of hits before that. A lot of them tethered to film, but that was just such a huge thing and such a huge movie. So I think it goes without saying. I don't know if The Bodyguard's on yours. A lot of these are going to mainly be songs as opposed to the actual albums.
The powerhouse ballad that goes along with it.
I mean, The Bodyguard is undeniable for I Will Always Love You, Gangster's Paradise, Dangerous Minds, another one where he won a Grammy for that song. The album, the soundtrack was nominated for a Grammy. I don't know much about the rest of it. I definitely have heard some of the songs on there. There's a unique one on there, though. There's this group called Sista who has a song on there. And Sista is actually the 4-piece girl group that Missy Elliott was in. They put out one album.
Wow.
Yeah, they have one album and they got a sync on this soundtrack as part of their deal. And then the band broke up and she went on to be Missy Elliott.
And there she goes.
So you got a little early Missy on that.
Nice.
And then Men in Black You know, like that again. My buddy had that soundtrack. He played it a bunch. I just wanted to hear that song. Like there wasn't a whole lot more on the soundtrack that I needed to hear.
Right.
But that song was a jam. I mean, I liked Will Smith. Like that says a lot about me. I was like, these are fun. I owned Big Willie style, you know, like
A lot
it
of
was
people,
cool. Yeah. why
millions
not?
of people did, right?
Yeah.
There was a lot of movies that were just like, oh, this is just a Will Smith vehicle. Like,
Yeah. Wild Wild West, Wiki Wild Wild West. Yeah.
So, you know, nothing to be ashamed of at all.
Yeah. What about
So,
you? Anything?
well, one of the things we kind of half jokingly mentioned that if we were to ban anything from our lists, it would be Disney movie soundtracks.
Yeah, it has to be.
Because that's
Yeah.
fully cheating.
It
But
is.
but it's definitely worth mentioning. You know, Lion
Oh, yeah.
King is one of the biggest soundtracks of all time,
Mhm.
are best selling. You know, Elton John and everything. Some truly incredible music on that soundtrack. I will do you one better and say, and I actually had to look up, like, oh man, was that still the 90s? But Tarzan, the Tarzan soundtrack. And it's
Wow.
almost become a meme at this point that, like, you know, Phil Collins didn't
Phil
have to
Collins.
go that
Yeah.
hard on this, you know, Tarzan soundtrack.
Yeah.
It's like, Phil Collins, it's Tarzan.
Yeah.
It's just make it adequate for the movie. And it's like
Yeah.
some of his best work. It's incredible music. The other, and of course there were other Disney movies in the 90s worth mentioning, but
Mhm.
it would just be, you know, a top 5 of Disney movies, and we don't need to do that.
Right.
But
maybe we do someday.
Maybe we do someday. There's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah.
I think the Tarantino soundtrack episode is going to have to end
we
up
can
happening
do that too.
at some point.
For sure.
The other honorable mention that I will touch on is That Thing You Do.
Nice one.
And for those that don't know, it's a movie about a fictitious rock band in the 60s coming up out of obscurity. Little bit of a Tom Hanks vehicle. But Adam Schlesinger, one of our favorite songwriters, rest in peace, sir. He did what he does best. He did that thing that he does, and, you know, wrote half a dozen, if not more, that didn't make it into the movie or the soundtrack. But this soundtrack almost plays like a Fountains of Wayne album. It is so good. Yeah. And the music is incredibly catchy. And just the fact that he wrote this music for this band, and it sounds like if you didn't know better and you were listening to the radio and That Thing You Do came on, you would think it was like, oh wait, who is, like, what band is that? Like, is this a Beach Boys song I've never heard? Is it the O-Neaters? Man, I love that movie. That's one of those movies that I'll go back to time and time again. Great soundtrack.
But there's one thing on that one, actually. So I know that it was kind of an open call for that. They knew Tom Hanks needed a pop song that was written for the movie that needs the hit, right? The movie's supposed to be about the hit. You need to actually write the hit song. And so Adam Duritz said at one point of the Counting Crows, he's like, a bunch of us tried, like, submitted for it, like put in for it. There were a handful of the quote unquote those guys of that era that submitted songs to be that hit. And Adam said he was just like, once he found out that Adam Schlesinger had put in for it, he was like, oh, well, we're all doomed.
Yeah.
You know, it's just
like, why are we wasting our time?
Yeah. He was kind of just like, I mean, and then he said he heard the song and he's like, yeah, I'm going home. I'm going to go do my own thing. Yeah.
Write another Counting Crows album.
Schlesinger is a man. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
Oh, rest in peace, that guy.
Yeah,
My goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. So any other honorable mentions that we need to talk about before we get into it?
No, I don't think so.
I think we're good.
You want me to go first? You want to go first?
Yes. Why don't you go first? As per usual, we'll start with our number 5, and up from there and go back and forth. And then we'll take notes along the way, and we'll have to hash some things out. Obviously, if we somehow hit on one that is on both of our lists, that'll probably rocket it close to the top, if not the top. But we'll see what happens. We'll see.
Yeah, something tells me that's not going to happen here, but we'll see.
That's fine. I'm going to take notes. You go ahead.
So I'm going to start off with Armageddon. So I don't know if you remember 1998. There was this weird thing that happened, and it happened
in general,
a couple times. Oh yeah, sure, there was that too. But like this happened a couple times you were talking about that like era of film and going to the movies with your friends or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Where you had two movies that seemed very similar. I remember A Bug's Life and Ants came out around the same time.
Yes.
And I'm like, why is there two bug movies?
I know.
Yeah, what is
and then
this?
You had fish. We had what was it? You had Finding Nemo and then A Shark's Tale.
Tale.
What?
It's like somebody's looking at the other answers. Like somebody sneaked a peek at something here, right? And so you had Deep Impact and Armageddon, and I saw both. You know, like
I did too.
When you couldn't decide which one to see, and you are in 9th or 10th grade, and you have a weekend, and there's Street Fighter and Tekken like out in the hallway, you go and see both. You know,
exactly.
But the thing about the Armageddon soundtrack. So I wasn't really into classic rock or whatever at the time. I looked at my dad's music and I was like, this is lame. But I did like Aerosmith. Like for some reason, Aerosmith stuck with me. Now this song, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, winds up being the most obnoxious hit song ever, right? Like it is just so frustratingly like overplayed. But
that happens to a lot of these songs though.
Yeah, like poor Carlos Santana and Rob Thomas, man. Like that's actually a good song, but damn. So you have this band who they feel like they're staging their third or fourth comeback now, like in the 90s. They've put out Nine Lives, which I bought. I liked their album Nine Lives, but it was not a success. And so now you have this like blockbuster movie that is tethered to this band who has 30 years of legacy, but like what and what else is on there? It's a bunch of like classic jams from Bob Seger and ZZ Top and Journey, you know, with a new vocalist, like Our Lady Peace. Like there's good stuff on there, but it's not like, so they're looking at this and they've got to be like, I don't know what's about to happen here. Like their album just tanked and this is supposed to be like the summer teen movie. Right. And then wouldn't you know it, it's the only time that Aerosmith will ever get a number one song in America out of all of their hits, out of everything that they've ever released. I wouldn't have guessed
that. Wow.
Right? The only number one song of theirs in America is that crazy freaking song. I put it on this list because it was so representative of that summer, that time in my life. I think, again, if we're talking, like I definitely approach this both with a personal bent, but also with what the 90s bigness that we were talking about represents here. This thing was in, my friends and I hung out at a pool hall in 9th grade. Go figure. I don't know why. It was us and a bunch of 60-year-old men. But like they had a jukebox and this was on in the jukebox and you just let this play because it also had LaGrange on it, you know, and like you could just roll through this thing and the older dudes would roll their eyes because it started off with I Don't Want to Miss a Thing. And then it would be like Journey and Bob Seger and they were into it. Yeah.
Anyone can get down to that.
So the movie was fine. It wasn't a
it was all right
movie. It was an okay movie. But the soundtrack was like a cultural moment. I felt like. What's your
disagree?
5? Yeah.
Okay. My number 5 is the soundtrack to the classic cinematic masterpiece Dumb and Dumber.
Oh my god. Okay.
I feel like in the 90s it was the funniest thing in the world to just act like a complete idiot. And we ate it up. We loved it. And there's, I'm not knocking it. I love
No.
it.
Yeah.
And so, and it was a stupid movie, one of the dumbest movies of all time, one of the greatest movies of all time. Two comedic geniuses playing off of each other and just having a blast and catching it all on film. And just a endlessly quotable movie. I mean, shoot, I have this funny memory of my sister, who is 6 years younger than me, so she was definitely too young to have seen the movie, when it had just came out. But she was traveling cross country, and and she sent me this video of her sitting on the side of the road. Like, you drove 1,000 miles in the wrong direction. Her and her boyfriend at the time played out this whole scene from Dumb and Dumber. And
Wow.
she sent it to me and I was like, yeah, how do you even know this? It's it's this endlessly quotable classic movie. And the soundtrack is a lot of silliness because there's just a lot of goofy music in the movie. You have Crash Test Dummies. It's just weird. The Ballad of Peter Pumpkinhead. Like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
Where did this band come from and why do they exist? But that song became a hit partially because of this movie. I don't even know if partially, probably mainly because of this movie.
I would assume so. Yeah.
You've got silly stuff that just gets stuck in your head, like that Willie Oneblood singing that whiny song. You've got Butthole Surfers on here. You've got Green Jelly doing The Bear Went Over the Mountain. Like, it's just crazy stuff.
Yeah.
But and then you've still got good stuff on there. Like, you've got D-Light doing You Sexy Thing. And the Proclaimers are on here. It's just a really, really fun soundtrack to listen to. Yeah. Also because it, it'll bring you back to a silly part of the movie, and you just start laughing and cracking up about it in your head. So, obviously it's not high on my list, but I have tons of fond memories of driving around listening to this. New Age Girl by Dead-Eye Dick, just like silly stuff, but singing it at the top of your lungs with your friends in the car is just so much fun. So that's my number 5 pick.
I dig it. I wasn't old enough, I think, at that point to see it in the theaters. I remember it being in the theaters, but I didn't go see that one at a movie theater. I definitely watched it at a friend's house maybe a year or two later. And yeah, it was just, it greenlit your ability to be so dumb and ridiculous.
Yes.
And I do remember the music in the movie being really fun and like just absurd. And I'm looking at the lineup and I see the Butthole Surfers and like the stuff that's on here represents that movie so well. Like, of just absurd. It's like I kind of expect to see Primus on here too, like it feels like
right?
They probably should have
done
been.
A lot of movie soundtracks.
Yeah. All right, so my number 4, and it was mentioned in the community, is Batman Forever. Now,
all right, so
Batman Forever.
Talk to me about Batman Forever, because I think before we started rolling, I mentioned how this one might have been like a one song only kind of thing, but you're about to expand my mind on this.
I think a little bit, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to go. I don't think I'm going to go too hard in the paint, but it's just number 4. But 2 massive hits off of a soundtrack, which usually doesn't happen, right? So, Kiss from a Rose. Kiss from a Rose is undeniable. Kiss from a Rose is the song that every girl in your middle school or high school was swooning over, and Seal became a household name. The crazy thing about Kiss from a Rose, so it was not a song for this movie. It was a song for his own album.
Yep.
And then it was on Neverending Story 3's soundtrack. Go figure.
Really?
Yeah, bananas. Like, why is that even on there?
I know that.
The confusion of like weird licensing stuff or whatever, right?
That's wild.
But then it gets put onto this soundtrack, and winds up being this massive hit. But like, you also have U2 who have created this song for this movie as well. Like this is a freestanding song that was written for the movie. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Because Bono was supposed to be in the movie. Like they had talked about having him. Yeah. They had talked about having him be in the movie. And it didn't work out. They couldn't figure out how to make it feel right. And
that'd be weird.
He couldn't sort it out. Yeah. And so instead they were like, they'd kind of like made this song around the Zooropa time. They had it sitting in the corner. It didn't really fit with the other stuff they put out. And so they're like, we'll give you this one, and winds up being a hit. So there's two huge hits on there. There's Method Man does a song specifically about the Riddler, who
that's awesome.
is probably so I also love this movie. So there's definitely some like favored placement here, because I just think that this movie is such a cool amalgam of like dark Batman with the like flashy comic book thing. I think they did it really well, and then it falls apart for Batman and Robin.
Right. Right.
But like Jim Carrey as the Riddler was so
How perfect is that?
Also, third time we've talked about Jim Carrey so far.
I mean, it's the 90s.
Yeah,
and we're talking about
fair.
movies, so
yeah, that's fair. But like, so he's so perfect. Honestly, it's a pretty weak Method Man RZA song, like as far as they go. But it's
like pizza. Even if it's not the best pizza, it's still pizza. Come on,
it's still pizza, and it's still him like rapping. It's not just like he made it. You could tell he watched the movie, and he's like, this dude is crazy and I have to write a song about him.
Yeah.
Like it is awesome. So it's fun to just experience that.
That's great.
But then there's one other thing. And again, I don't know how familiar you are with this movie, but with me, it's kind of an all or nothing situation. So the movies that I've watched and I could probably recite them by memory. And then I just have never seen anything else. But so there's this scene in Batman Forever where Edward is kind of finding himself before he goes full on evil, and he goes to his home, and his home is this weird apartment with this like creepy doll and all this stuff. And there's this jangly kind of ethereal twisted song playing, and I remember being enamored with it. I'm like, what is this song? And it's a Flaming Lips song called Bad Days. It's called Bad Days, and I love this song, dude. And I think it's partially because it's paired with this like bananas scene and this amazing character that's just off his rocker and losing it, but he's also been downtrodden, so there's an emo sense to it. But like this song is so perfectly synced and set to what is happening in that scene. It almost there's only a few of these songs that's actually in the movie, and that's one of them. But it like there's been times when I bought a soundtrack and the song that was in the movie isn't on the soundtrack for some reason, right? Because the legal stuff didn't line up or whatever. And I remember getting this soundtrack and being like, man, I hope that song's on here. And sure enough, it is. It's like right near the end.
Oh, nice.
I listened to that nonstop. And the last thing I'll say about this is it's like, I mean, what did we say? We said U2, Flaming Lips, Method Man, like Wu-Tang, right? And then you have Brandy, The Offspring, Mazzy Star.
Oh, really?
Like,
oh, wow.
Dude, it is like you would never see this. And again, we're talking like 97, 98. No, earlier than that, 90, 95, 96. But like that is when they were the biggest. When would you have Sunny Day Real Estate and Wu-Tang on the same release?
Oh my God.
Like just doesn't happen. So it was,
you're
it's
right,
such
95.
it's such a unique moment. and again, I know that there's a bunch of nostalgia playing into this pick for me, but it so identifies like what the 90s were when this was that sort of sculpted vehicle for a film.
Oh wow, Nick Cave and Massive Attack are on here too. Wow.
Yeah, it's so crazy, dude.
Okay.
But I definitely remember not listening to this cover to cover. This is one that you skip around. This is one where it's just like, I'm just going to listen to the Flaming Lips song over and over again.
Yeah.
But like,
you fixate on stuff like that. I understand.
You can't listen to this. Like, how do you go from like PJ Harvey to Brandy to Massive Attack? Like it's not cohesive by any stretch.
Right.
But it is a really cool, like, cross-section snapshot of some crazy stuff that was going on at the time.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, shoot. You got me sold on it.
Ah.
That's
What's
literally
your 4?
like I knew about the U2 and Seal song, but I literally didn't know about any of the others. So
that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
I've never listened to the Dumb and Dumber soundtrack, and now I am very intrigued.
That's one that's difficult. You'll have to find like a YouTube playlist or something, because that's one that's all chopped up on if you try to go just stream it. Okay. Number 4, another kind of a weird one. And I kind of hinted at it with one of the feelers that I put out there when we were, asking the community question. But my number 4 is Tank Girl.
Oh, okay.
Now, the connection with Tank Girl is that it was partially created by the visual artist that went on to create Gorillaz with Damon Albarn.
Oh,
so it's kind of that kind of vision, you know what I mean? Cool. Really weird movie. But very 90s, very like extreme 90s vibes, trying to be weird as possible, definite comic book vibes about it. I think it's based on a comic book, and someone's going to school me and say, I can't believe you didn't know that. But just a really interesting movie, but so much cool music is on this soundtrack. So you've got the kind of the big hit, so to speak, is Army of Me by Bjork, which was a huge hit in the 90s anyway.
Yeah.
But you've got a lot of 90s staples on here. You've got Hole, Bush does a song here. Veruca Salt is on here.
Veruca Salt, yeah.
Portishead, L7, which you don't hear a whole lot about, but they definitely encapsulate a lot of that that 90s sound. And then Devo is on here with Girl You Want. Like it just, if you saw the film, you would it kind of works with the movie. And then Ice-T has a really interesting song here right at the end. I think it's so like encapsulates so much 90s music. And it's all of these songs are kind of the same energy.
Okay.
The outlier might be Devo, but
but Mothersbaugh, Mothersbaugh
does a lot
of stuff. Tons. He did it. I mean, I think he was involved in a bunch of cartoon stuff, and Happy Gilmore. He did a lot of stuff.
Well, a lot of the Wes Anderson.
He did Rushmore. Yeah.
So, which we might talk about in a little bit here. But it's a really cool soundtrack to a really unique and weird movie that I feel like a lot of people haven't seen or might know a lot about. It's definitely worth looking up and checking out, even if it's just for the 90s-ness of it. I don't know how well it stands up, but it's definitely unique. We'll just put it that way.
I feel like I don't even really know this movie. Like, I feel like I need to see this movie.
And I'm
good.
Go ahead. I'm just probably not representing it very well.
But is it good? Like, because some of these soundtracks we're talking about where the soundtrack's amazing and then the movie's kind of like meh, like
it's just okay. So it's another one of those. Might be, obviously it wasn't nearly as popular as like Spawn, but it was based on a comic book. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic sci-fi
Ooh.
thing. So
That's my
that,
language.
yeah. I don't really know what else to say about it. It's just really
Okay.
unique. It's got a little bit of Mad Max influence, but you've got a female tough girl lead who kicks ass and takes names, and she's like, drives a tank, and it's like, how much cooler could you get than that?
Yeah.
So it's fun. It's definitely
All right.
fun, but
I'm gonna check it out.
it's a little bit odd. It's just weird. You've got
All right.
like this pig character with
Is
prosthetic
he? Oh,
pig
Ice-T's
face.
in the movie.
Yes, that's right. It's Ice-T.
Yeah, there he is. Yeah,
There he
Yeah.
is.
that's awesome. Okay, yeah,
Um,
I need to see this movie.
the
First of all,
soundtrack was partially assembled by Courtney Love. So
well, that's
yeah,
why Hole's on there. Yeah,
but there's a lot going on here.
that's so cool.
Another quick side note is there is a song by a band called the Magnificent Bastards, which is actually a Scott Weiland side project.
Oh,
Yeah, so there's
Huh.
some little interesting tidbits here.
And sometimes I wonder, I mean, I don't know anything about it, but sometimes artists like that would do like side project things so that they could work on stuff, like they'd be
Yeah.
contractually obligated to do something under a different name.
Mhm.
So I wonder if that played into it. Huh. All right. Number 3. Let's see. I mean, I could go either way.
You're still not 100%, huh?
Well, I have my
I was there
5.
too. I was kind of
Yeah.
there too.
2 and 3 are tough, and I feel like I'm gonna go with Romeo and Juliet for the third, because I
There you
feel like
go.
I stacked the bottom with some gaudy pop box office bangers, and I feel like I need a little redemption before I do it again.
Yeah, I need some edge.
Yeah. Well, you had Butthole Surfers, so I need Butthole Surfers. I've seen this movie 2 or 3 times, so that's something. Hadn't seen it until I met my wife, though. She was the one who showed this to me. But I remember a bunch of people having this soundtrack, so I knew the soundtrack a little bit better than I knew the movie.
Yeah.
Very cool lineup. Very, very cool lineup. One of those that we talked about, Karen Rackman specials. Just well tethered into the movie, as I then saw when I watched it. You had Garbage, #1 Crush, Local God. Like, I love Everclear. I think art's awesome. Butthole Surfers, Love Fool by the Cardigans. It's just it's such a cool thing. And then like now, Radiohead, that's kind of cool, but like at the time I didn't really care.
Right, at the time. Well, it's interesting. This was pre OK Computer.
Right.
And
okay, interesting.
That may be why it's kind of like
okay.
They weren't one of the like headliners of the album, but the radio that song Talk Show host
it's on
the album is right? I don't think so. I think it was for
is
the
it
movie.
For this?
We might have to look it up. Of course, it's one of those that kind of got more popular later on. And I think it's on probably like a B-sides collection thing.
Maybe it was like a bonus track or something.
Of course. Yeah, it was one of those. Let's see where this is from. It might have been on it was either a B-side or on one of their EPs for...
Yeah, I don't see it on anything, so maybe
I think it was on the Street Spirit single.
Yeah.
Let me see really quick. Yep. Okay. So it's basically the B-side to the Street Spirit single, which is off of the Benz. So yeah, that makes sense.
Pretty crazy. It just like we keep coming to these points where it's this one isn't a very diverse soundtrack. It's very calculated. And you can listen to this cover to cover and have it be fairly consistent. You've got a lot of that kind of like smart 90s alt rock that's mixed in there, with the sort of, artsy angle of this, like edgy artsy angle of this movie.
Yeah, definitely.
So It's a really cool one. It's just something that I remember. Again, we're talking 96, 97. This is when I started listening to music, and I had friends that were listening to music a whole bunch, and like you were going to record stores and buying stuff, and this was just that. Like I feel like Christmas time, like everybody coming out of Christmas got this as a gift, and a bunch of people were walking around with it.
Absolutely.
What's your
Good
number
pick.
3?
Good pick. Okay. Number 3 is Trainspotting.
All right.
Obviously one of my big musical discoveries in the 90s is kind of that I don't know what you want to call it, third wave British invasion that was happening. And I was into the Trainspotting soundtrack, and this is probably the only one of these where this is the case. But I was into the Trainspotting soundtrack before I saw the movie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because it was kind of it's a very adult movie. There's just a lot of, you've got some gross stuff, and you've got a lot of drug use and stuff like that. So definitely not something that I could have playing in the house with my parents around. So I didn't see the movie until later, but going into music stores and seeing the soundtrack and looking at the artists on the soundtrack, I was like, whoa. So it's very, it's a very UK film, and it's a very British or very UK soundtrack. Obviously that Iggy Pop Lust for Life is like the big, everyone knows that rhythm, and what's that song is the moment that you hear those drums. Unless you get faked out and it's actually a Jet song. But we won't talk about that. But you got Brian Eno, New Order,
Blur,
and then you've got Blur, of course, Pulp, which might be the most British band ever, Elastica, who we've talked about. So it's a little bit of a. It's funny because it's such a dark. It's definitely probably what you would consider a dark comedy. And the soundtrack sort of reflects that, to where it's kind of both fun and dark and depressing at the same time. So I remember listening to this soundtrack in the car quite a bit on longer drives. And it's a really well-rounded soundtrack, really, really well curated. I'm not sure who did it, who put it together, but they knew what they were doing in more ways than one. It was the perfect time for a soundtrack like this, with these bands like Elastica and Blur and Pulp being getting more popular in the States. So it hit kind of at the perfect time, and it just says a lot about what a great soundtrack can do. Because again, like I hadn't even seen, I owned the soundtrack and had the CD, and I had not even seen the movie yet. It was just a great compilation of music from the UK that I could just pop in and enjoy.
I think so this movie, I didn't see this until college, and I think I've only seen it that one time. It's definitely one of those movies that I've always meant to go back and see, because I feel like now, with my brain that's not 18, I could probably like actually appreciate all of this. This soundtrack was, I mean, it was and has continued to be one of like the most well-regarded soundtracks of all time, just like as it's put together and as it represents the movie, as it represents Brit rock, if you like, or it diminutizes it, but like British music and British pop music. And I would I would wager, because it's Danny Boyle, who is kind of like Tarantino, very involved.
Oh,
and
okay,
immersed.
that makes sense. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
He's very immersed in his projects. So I would assume that, I mean, I'm sure he had a music director that worked with him on it, but I would assume that it was somebody that was working hand in hand with him. Like, he seems like that kind of guy who probably handpicked a lot of this music to be connected to this project. That's a great pick. That's a really good one.
And then, like, one last funny note about it is that, from what I understand, Oasis was approached to provide a song for the movie, but they turned it down.
It does seem like that's the big glaring hole here, right?
Right, exactly.
I guess that makes a lot of sense.
I'm not sure exactly why, but they said no, we're not gonna contribute a song to the movie.
I bet you that first of all, like, I wonder if both brothers agreed to that, or if that's a point of contention between the two. And also, like, I bet you that's just another notch for Damon Albarn, looking at that being like, you guys aren't even on one of the greatest soundtracks of all time.
Exactly.
I'm standing over here with Pulp and Iggy Pop. Brian Eno's riding next to me. Where are y'all at?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Amazing.
But that was definitely, so I know what you mean. I kind of ribbed you a little bit for it, but it was hard for me to pick whether that was going to be number 2 or number 3.
Yeah, for sure.
But that ended up being my number 3.
Yeah. All right. Well, so then my number 2 is one that is going to be very contentious, I think. And that is Godzilla, the album. So this album is bananas. This album. So I don't know if you remember, there was New Year's Eve, 1997. There was a commercial where Godzilla broke to the Times Square ball as it was dropping. It was like a whole thing that aired. And just as kids, again, middle school, whatever, like, we were just like, this is crazy. Like, what's happening here? Oh my God, Godzilla is coming. And this was going to be the monster blockbuster of all time, you know? And it wasn't. Like, it was it sold okay, or it did okay that first week or two, and then it completely fell off, and it almost became a joke. But the crazy thing is, and we're talking about soundtracks as a marketing vehicle, like, everybody knew about this movie because
of course.
It had 2 huge songs off of it. It had Heroes, the Bowie cover by the Wallflowers.
Right, by the Wallflowers. Mm-hmm.
And it had Come With Me, which, like, I remember watching the music video for Puff Daddy doing Come With Me, and my dad is in the kitchen, and he is like, what is this garbage? And I'm like, I don't know, it's Puff Daddy and Jimmy Page playing on TV. And he's like, this guy just stole Kashmir. And I'm like, Jimmy Page is on the TV, Dad.
Jimmy Page, yeah.
Like, I see him there. Like, it's not like he just got, like, it's not a hologram. We didn't know about those yet. You know, like, he has co-signed on this thing, which is crazy, by the way. Like, and again, like, now understanding hip hop even better than I did then, it is really cool. Like, instead of, like, I mean, Puff Daddy was the king of just, like, grabbing people's music and sampling it and taking credit for it. But like, if you have the cosign and the appearance and the performance of the person that you're working with, then it's really a collaboration. And it's not the worst Puff Daddy song. But then you have like, again, like, this was going to be such a big thing that they got the Foo Fighters to write a song for it. And, like, this is 98.
Oh, they have an original for it?
Yeah. A320 is like originally for this, and then it comes out as a B-side on something else. But, like, they write a song for this. Rage Against the Machine, dude. Like, this is the Machine. this is the marketing machine, and Rage
Yeah.
Against the Machine has an exclusive song on this soundtrack.
There was some controversy around that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because there's like a lyric in that song that kind of throws in the face of the fact, like it's almost like they did it to put it on there to fight within the machine, like they're raging against the machine from within the machine. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. But yeah, Jamiroquai has an exclusive song on here, and a lot of these things wind up coming out
Ben
as
Folds 5
B-sides.
is here.
Yeah, but you just like, it was such a moment that probably should or could have been more than it was, and it just wasn't. Like, the soundtrack went on to be this huge thing.
Yeah.
And the movie, I mean, nobody talks about that movie. They did a bunch of other ones afterwards. Nobody cared. I've never seen it. I didn't go see it.
Oh, you haven't seen it?
No, and I was the perfect age to go see it. But
I saw it at the time, and like I kind of liked it, but so like when you watch it, like we actually watched it recently because I think we watched it last year. My younger daughter, who would have been like 5 at the time, she got on this huge Godzilla kick. She loved Godzilla because we watched one of the newer ones. I think it was Godzilla King of the Monsters. And she loved it. We were like, oh, this is going to be too scary for you. She's like, no, it looks great. I want to see it. So we're like, okay, it's Godzilla. How bad could it be? It's not going to be gory or anything. So, and she loved it. So she, pulled up every Godzilla movie she could find. And this was one of them. And I walked into the living room and I was like, why are you watching a Matthew Broderick movie? And I was like, oh, it's Godzilla. I haven't seen this in 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's actually okay. So if you watch it so who else is in this, right? You've got Matthew Broderick, Hank Azaria, Harry Shearer.
Harry Shearer.
It's like, dude, if you watch it like it's a comedy, it's brilliant. It's
not what it's supposed to be.
Hilarious. No, it's so go into it with an open mind and just enjoy it for the ridiculousness of it all. It's awesome.
I probably would, dude. Again, like talking about Tank Girl, post-apocalyptic, it's great. I love Cloverfield. Like a big monster ripping something apart is the best for me. I definitely I should definitely see this movie, man.
Well, go
and
into
Roland
it.
Emmerich did it. I love Independence Day. This is crazy that I haven't seen this movie.
It just feels, I can understand why it didn't really hit, because it's when you look at the cast and like but like the seriousness of the marketing and the sound, how hard the soundtrack goes. It's weird because it's like, you've got all this, you've got the 90s extreme thing going on. You've got all this, marketing, like this is going to be the biggest thing ever. This is going to be the biggest thing since Jurassic Park. Yeah. And this soundtrack that goes incredibly hard. And you've got Matthew Broderick and Hank Azaria.
It's so weird. It's so weird.
It's so weird, right?
I feel like I don't know why I didn't want to see this movie, other than the fact that, like, I know it got bad reviews, and maybe as a kid I got swayed by it. Like, this should have been something where I was just like, yeah, I'm going to go see this stupid monster movie because I love stupid monster movies because I'm a stupid kid,
Right?
It's so weird.
I don't know, man, but it's entertaining. I'll just put it that way.
For sure. All right. I got to check it out.
It's worth a watch.
What's your number 2?
Okay. We knew this was coming, and I don't know how deep down this rabbit hole you want to go, but my number 2 is Pulp Fiction.
Okay. There we go.
I mean, and you probably could have put, any of those. We had a lot of conversations recently because of all of this about Jackie Brown.
Yeah.
And if I had, if you put a gun to my head, I think Jackie Brown is the better movie and might be a more fitting soundtrack for its movie. Great soundtrack. But in terms of the pure 90s, like eclectic, everything but the kitchen sink style of soundtrack, like there's almost no better representation of that type of soundtrack than Pulp Fiction.
Right.
You know, this is the soundtrack that introduced me as a budding guitar player to Dick Dale.
Okay.
Went out and bought Dick Dale records and started cranking up the reverb knob on my amps
Amazing,
and playing
dude.
surf music. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't know who Dick Dale was before the Pulp Fiction soundtrack.
Mhm.
I didn't know who Urge Overkill was. I barely knew who. God, my brain wanted to say Casey and the Sunshine Band, but that is the absolute wrong name.
Eh.
It's shoot. I hate how my brain does this, man. And it's been doing this ever since COVID. I hit an absolute brick wall. Who does Jungle Boogie?
Jungle Boogie.
Why am I drawing a
Man,
blank
why
on
am
this?
I can't think
All right,
of it
here we
either.
go.
Cool,
I got-
Cool in the Gang?
Yes, it's Cool in the Gang.
Okay.
Stupid.
Yeah.
It's Cool in the Gang. My brain wanted to say Casey and the Sunshine Band. I'm such an
Yeah.
idiot. Okay, so we're gonna leave it in. I'm not editing that out because
Yeah,
this
why
is
not?
real life, folks.
Yeah.
So you got Cool
No
in the
judgment.
Gang. Al Green is on this. Dusty Springfield. Oh my God, there's so much good music on here that I just didn't know about before this, and I loved this soundtrack. I think more than anything else, it got me into some surf music. Urge Overkill has a little bit of that kind of beachy, surfy sound to them, so it got me into that kind of style. And then there's that whole Elvis versus Beatles discussion in the restaurant, and obviously this seems like more of an Elvis themed movie, and it just kind of shows in the soundtrack and in the overall theme of the music in it. I think this also, I probably lied or spoke too soon when I said what I said about Train Spotting, because I'm pretty sure I got into this album before seeing the movie as well. Because this was another one that,
I was gonna
like,
say, yeah.
I don't want my parents knowing that I'm watching Pulp Fiction in 1998 or whatever it was.
Yeah, unless you were sneaking into some of these theaters. I mean, I know that we're a little, our age gap is a little bit, but not, I mean, you must have been 11 or 12 at the time that this was coming out. I don't know how you were getting into those. Although, to be fair,
I was
yeah.
older. I was a little older than that.
Okay.
I was like 15, 16.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I could buy a ticket for a PG-13 movie and then sneak into the R-rated theater every now and then. Or I had a couple friends that had cool moms that would, like, they're good. Let them go in.
Yeah.
I have a couple of memories of that.
Yeah, see, I had Smitty. Smitty was my age, and he was my best friend, but he looked like he was in high school, and so he would be able to buy R-rated movie tickets, and then he would
or rent them from the video store.
Exactly, dude. Smitty was the man for that, and then my parents found
Smitty.
out. Yeah, we went to go see Fled, which is a terrible movie, but it was an R-rated movie, and I was 12 and probably shouldn't have been in there.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah. So Pulp Fiction, I've never seen all of it. I've seen bits and pieces of it, but this soundtrack, so it's definitely just like any of his other stuff, right? Where it is as curated as the film is. It is curated to the film. The music is a living, breathing part of the movie.
Yes,
right.
It is.
And when you listen to this soundtrack, because I have heard a good chunk of the soundtrack, there's like texture points through it. It's not just music, right? I think is like dialogue and stuff. Like it is like cover to cover what the movie is in audio form almost.
Yeah, exactly. And despite how eclectic it is, it has that kind of thread somehow that runs it all together. And I think all of his soundtracks have that, but this one just kind of takes the cake for just how out there and eclectic it sounds, but still is somehow cohesive at the same time. So it's just a huge achievement in, whatever the word is, curation. So major props for that to, the filmmakers and whoever clears all of this music from, across decades of time. It can't be easy. It's definitely no small feat for sure.
Yeah.
This one was never going to be my number one, but I think it definitely deserves the number 2 spot. So that's
never going to be your number one. Is so
it
interesting.
It couldn't be, but and you might. It might make more sense why once you hear my number one.
Okay, all right. Well, so I'll do my number one, which is in line with everything else we've been talking about. I chose Can't Hardly Wait. This movie I actually like a lot. I've watched it a bunch of times. I'm not the biggest like kind of teen movie fan. There's a few of them that I dig, but like American Pie is such a juggernaut, and it's a soundtrack that probably should be mentioned, but it never resonated with me for whatever reason. But there is, I liked Smash Mouth. Smash Mouth was fine. And they had a hit song off of this album. But it checked the boxes of, it had Third Eye Blind, Blink-182, Busta Rhymes, Guns N' Roses. Like, it was all of these bands that I was separately into, and the movie clicked. I saw the movie. There was great music in the movie, and I remember going to the wall like right afterwards, like the next day it must have been, and looking at the back of the lineup. And I didn't buy a lot of soundtracks because you were ostensibly buying a song and then hoping that the rest of it was good.
Right.
But
sometimes it was the case. Yeah.
Yeah. But when I looked at this, a lot of the time. Yeah. And maybe you got exposed to some new stuff. Like, that was a really cool way to find new music.
Yeah.
But there was, so when I looked at the back of this CD, which I'll hold up right now, it's still got my wall sticker on it.
There it is.
Lifetime music guarantee is going to get me a whole lot of help if this ever breaks. But I remember looking at it and being like, man, I like 7 or 8 of the artists on here.
Nice.
And it's other than Graduate, which I had on their first album, Third Eye Blind's first album. Like, I didn't have these songs. I didn't have Dude Ranch by Blink-182 yet. It was only just kind of learning about them. And so picking this up, like, it's definitely the kind of soundtrack when you look at it, it seems like one of those ones that you couldn't listen to cover because it's so all over the place. But I did. And like, there's stuff on here that are from bands that I never heard from again, like Braham and Black Lab and Dog's Eye View, but I can remember all of those songs. Like, I know I have no idea who those are. I have no idea who those people are, but I know all those songs.
Right.
I haven't watched this movie in a few years. It's becoming harder and harder to go back to certain things from the 90s these days because there are some problematic things. And I'm a little concerned about Seth Green. I don't know what I'm going to see when I do watch this. But it's a movie.
Everyone should be concerned about Seth Green.
Yeah. But I love Jennifer Love Hewitt though. Oh my God. But it's a movie that I feel like if I go back to it and it holds up at all, like, I definitely want my kid to see it. I don't know. It's such American Pie did a thing that it over exaggerated a lot of stuff in a really fun way. And I think that resonated with a lot of people. Whereas Can't Hardly Wait, I really feel like while it did accentuate certain things,
it wasn't as goofy.
It was kind of like 10 Things I Hate About You. Like, those two
a little
movies
more real
to me, where it's like there's a couple over the top moments where, like, is he really going to be crowd surfing to the Guns N' Roses song in somebody's living room? Probably not. But like, a lot of this stuff is fairly believable,
Yeah.
like it definitely. And I was on the cusp of high school, like I was just into high school when this is coming out, and I'm like, man, this is me in like 2 years. Maybe I need to
Right.
get a pair of goggles and like act like Seth Green, like
When did
just
that
walk around with
start? With ski goggles and
ski
stuff.
goggles on. Yeah.
Oh man.
So yeah, so I love this album. I still, it's like one of the few soundtracks that I'll still throw in my my CD wallet, because
Nice.
it's something that you can kind of skip around in, and it's just got bangers, man. It's really great, and I think it. Again, I keep going back to American Pie. American Pie gets the credit for being the teen movie with the soundtrack to end all soundtracks, and I think it's this one. I like 10 Things I Hate About You has a great one too, but it's very ska influenced. Like there's a lot of Letters to Cleo, which I love, but this one I just think
It's more well-rounded.
I think they nailed it. I think
Yeah.
it just like all across the board between like the movie and the actual collection of songs. I think they really nailed it.
Awesome.
All right, what's the number one?
Okay, so this one, as it kind of seems to be for you, this was definitely more of a deeply personal pick, and this movie came out at just the perfect time for a budding guitar player, a budding kid that liked to play with camcorders and make stupid little shows. My number one is the Wayne's World movie soundtrack.
Wow.
And
all right.
It came out at just the absolute perfect time for me. It was goofy, but the goofiness was still smart. And even at that age, I understood, like when they're having the whole conversation about selling out while they're like holding up a Pepsi and talking about what they're taking for their headache, and they're just like dropping brands left and right. Like even at like probably 11 or 12 years old when I was seeing this, I understood the joke. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the soundtrack, and it's like the scene where they're jamming to Bohemian Rhapsody in the car.
Iconic.
One of the most iconic movie scenes of the 90s.
100%.
But it resonated so much because that's what all of us did. We would drive around and be goofy with our friend. I mean, I wasn't doing that at 12 years old, but especially later on as a teenager, when there was nothing to do, especially in the 90s, there really was hardly any internet yet. Nobody was glued to their smartphones. There was nothing to do. We drove around and listened to music and did goofy stuff with our friends in the car. Mm-hmm. And so, with Bohemian Rhapsody being on that soundtrack, that was the song. And it became like a hit a second time. From what I understand, it wasn't even that really big of a hit when the song first came out. It was really the movie that made it a hit.
Yeah. No, for sure.
But, you've got Jimi Hendrix on the soundtrack, with the iconic scene of Dana Carvey as Garth doing his Foxy Lady routine to the Dream Woman. And you've got Alice Cooper, you've got Black Sabbath, you've got there's actually even an early Soundgarden song on here that's not for some reason, not in every version of the soundtrack. I'm not sure why. And you've got Tia Carrere's versions of songs on here, which who didn't love Tia Carrere in the 90s? But there's just so much to love about the soundtrack. And of course, it's a lot more geared towards, kind of the metalhead side of the Wayne's World universe. But it's just such a fun soundtrack, start to finish. You can listen to the whole thing. And the best place to listen to it is in the car, banging your head with your friends.
That's right.
Driving to go get some jelly donuts.
Dude, I mean, everybody had this CD. Like this was everywhere. Or the tape.
It was early 90s. I think we had
I will
tape.
say this is definitely one, and I didn't grab it. I didn't. But this is one that I do remember getting reissued, which is kind of crazy because you have to think that there's a lot of pre-existing music on this. It's not music that might have been contractually signed to the movie itself. So I think it speaks to how like the thirst for a vinyl repressing of something like this. Like they knew that it's worth going through the trouble to put that back together because it would sell, because people want it, because it's such an important soundtrack.
I mean, it went double platinum. It's a huge album.
Yeah.
Insanely popular.
You can't forget how big this movie was too. I mean, like I remember, like, this is another one where in 92 I was 8, so like should not have been seeing this movie.
No, probably not me either.
But like I was definitely in this kid Ryan's garage behind his house, and he had a TV with a VHS player, and like I was probably 9 or 10 at that point, and we were watching it like out in the garage because that was a cool thing to do, and his parents weren't around, and then all
you do is play out scenes from the movie with your friends for the rest of your life.
That's 100% right. Yeah. Iconic movie and a great number one pick for sure. Yeah. All right. So we need a high five here though.
Yeah.
So here's my take, because I jotted down your list here. So, I mean, I feel like Trainspotting, Pulp Fiction, and like your top 3 need to stay at least in the high 5, but also probably near the top 3.
You think so?
Mainly, I think so. Here's my thing though, and this is a weird little twist. I feel like, as a guy who hasn't even seen the movie, Pulp Fiction's probably the number one soundtrack, like, of the 90s. Like, the high 5 is like our nostalgia comes and plays into this. So I'm open to the dialogue here, but like ostensibly, if we're just going off of like what is the most important, or what are the greatest or most impactful or representative, like whatever the criteria we want to set.
Right.
I feel like Pulp Fiction is kind of undeniable as like maybe the greatest soundtrack of the 90s, or one, like I if it's not one, it's got to be 2. So that's got to hold firm, and I feel like Wayne's World's got to stay up there too. So I'm not even fighting for 1 and 2. I just don't know which one's 1 and which one's 2, basically,
I hear you, and it's funny because now I'm going to give you the counter argument to my own pick, but Pulp Fiction may be one of the best movie soundtracks of all time.
Yeah,
but I think the argument that you could make against it is it's not really indicative of 90s music.
Yeah,
and I don't know if that's part of our criteria or not. Really,
it's an interesting
but it's a tough. Yeah, it's. So I know it deserves to be in the top 5, but if we're talking about 90s movie soundtracks, how important is the factor of the soundtrack being made up of 90s music? Like it's a factor, but how important is that factor?
I think that might actually tick it down for me. So
that's what I'm saying. I'm saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Because like Romeo and Juliet needs to be up there.
Yeah,
and you made a very strong case for Batman Forever.
I did.
Which is funny because those are kind of lower on your list than some of the other ones.
That's right. That's right. And I'll say that Can't Hardly Wait, I don't think needs to be in the high 5, even though it's my number 1. That's strongly a nostalgia.
Number one's always a personal pick, right?
and I feel like Armageddon doesn't need to be in there. It'd be kind of funny if Godzilla made it, because I do think that Godzilla does represent something about the 90s.
It really does.
So perfectly that maybe having it in the high 5 gives us the scope of what we're talking about. Like if I'm looking at the high 5 and it in no particular order was Romeo and Juliet, Wayne's World, Pulp Fiction, Trainspotting, and Godzilla, like
it needs to be there.
That feels like the 90s to me. Like that really feels like the 90s.
There's something so 90s about having this massive soundtrack with Puff Daddy and
Yeah,
like
the
sampling
Wallflowers.
a classic
Yeah,
song with, and then
yeah.
all the other bands that are on there with
Yeah.
this huge like marketing campaign, and the movie bombs.
Yeah, it's so
There's
perfect.
something so 90s about that
Yeah.
that it might need to be up there.
Yeah, I feel like we got to walk away with this with the cred of those other four, of it being like good cinema paired with good music, good marketing vehicles, like all across the board, like quality. And then we need the cheese, because the 90s had plenty of it.
Oh, of course.
Like, so we need some cheese on the list for one of these. And so I do feel like it's probably got to be Godzilla. I look, Armageddon's good. It's a song. Like, there's some other stuff on there that's fine. Godzilla's a bit of a behemoth, though. So I would say that, or Batman Forever. I put it to you. I don't know if you feel strongly either way. I do feel like Batman Forever. I'm going back on myself now, because Batman Forever,
Wild.
It's so expansive in what it covers. So maybe that instead of Godzilla. I don't know.
There's also an argument for Romeo and Juliet, because it's really amazing what they did. I mean, you've got.
Well, it's got to be on there, 100%.
It really, I think it should, because it has to be. It's straight up 90s music, but it's just literally Shakespeare, and you've got Leonardo DiCaprio. Like that's 90s.
Right. Are you okay if Dumb and Dumber or Tank Girl don't make the final list?
I don't think Tank Girl makes the cut.
Okay.
It's very 90s in a niche kind of way. There is an argument for Dumb and Dumber, but it's not as strong of a soundtrack. It was more of a kind of a cultural moment, and the soundtrack is just kind of a mostly silly companion to the movie, right? And it's fun.
It feels like a 6 or 7 to me. It feels like it's just off the list.
Yeah, it's probably Dumb and Dumber is vying with Batman Forever for number 6. I think is where we're at.
Yeah, I think so too.
In my opinion.
Yeah, I think so
too. So where does Train Spotting land? And I don't know how much history you have with the soundtrack. It's very focused and very, Britpop centered, but it's also very 90s, and it fits the theme of the movie. And the movie itself was a cultural moment. Yeah. So I think it deserves to be there. I don't know if it deserves to be all the way up to number 3 though.
Yeah, I think that, it's held its relevance so well, but it does the same thing that we're talking about with Pulp Fiction, where it represents the 90s, but it also represents some of the songs on there are from the 70s. It's true. Not strictly in strictly 90s music,
which brings it down a little bit, probably.
Yeah, I almost feel like I'm just looking back over Romeo and Juliet, because that is very 90s.
Yeah,
Cardigans, Everclear, Garbage, Butthole Surfers, and to apply that to that film, it kind of clicks.
It's kind of genius.
Where my rough is Wayne's World 1, Pulp Fiction 2, Romeo and Juliet 3, Train Spotting 4, and then Godzilla 5.
Godzilla.
So good. I love it so much.
I mean, looking at that list, that's really hard to argue with. I have no complaints about that list.
I think it's
and
pretty
I'm really
solid.
kind of amazed that we came to it so quickly. But oh my God, Godzilla being on that list is so beautiful.
It's funny, man. It's just I can't believe Rage Against the Machine is on that freaking thing.
And they're on it like giving the middle finger to the movie, which is a very 90s thing to do. It's a very Rage Against the Machine thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I think we got our high five. Do you feel?
Is there? I mean, honestly, I think we do.
Yeah,
I think so. It's that simple. Yeah. So, number 1, Wayne's World.
So
number 2, Pulp Fiction.
Yep.
Yeah. Number 3, Romeo and Juliet. Number 4, Train Spotting. Number
Number
5,
5 is
Godzilla 1998.
the Beast from the East, man. That's great. So now that we've got this, so then let's I do quick cleanup crew because we're running long here. But there were one or two things that I wasn't sure that you were going to bring up that I didn't bring up as honorable mentions on the front end. So
Oh, okay.
real quick. So Rushmore, not on your list.
Well, that's funny because as I was at some point along the way, I realized in my head that Rushmore originally was in the running for my top 5 and should have been one of my honorable mentions because
Okay.
me and my friend Andrew would drive around listening to the Rushmore soundtrack constantly.
Right. Yeah.
And it's such a great movie, great 90s movie. Not like indicative of the 90s necessarily, just a really, really great movie. But it didn't end up making my top 5. It probably would have been like 6 or 7 for me.
Okay. We Reality Bites is another one where I didn't know if that was going to come up. Reality Bites, Ben Stiller movie, which launched the career of Lisa Loeb, where she was just messing around in the city, and Ethan Hawke was her neighbor, and she got to know the guy, and he heard her. She didn't have a record deal or anything, and he passed the song along to Ben Stiller and also to Karen Rackman, and launched her career, and it was a huge soundtrack.
Yeah, and she was not signed when that
nothing. Yeah. And there was one more too. So for me, Bulworth was a big one.
You mentioned that.
Yeah, I liked Bulworth a lot. I mean, Ghetto Superstar was a huge hit. But there was a bunch of the soundtrack was my first exposure to Wu-Tang, Public Enemy, Cypress Hill. Like they were all on there. There was LL Cool J was on there. Like there's it was almost like a gateway drug to hip hop for me at the time. And I never seen the movie. It seems fine. And I skipped around on this a bunch because I was kind of like dipping my toes into hip hop, and I'm like, Public Enemy kind of scares me. I don't know what's happening here. Like, who's this guy? But ultimately wound up listening to this whole thing and like finding appreciation for everything that was on the soundtrack.
Yeah. I definitely remember. I think that's one that is the soundtrack is more memorable than the movie itself.
Yeah. And then nobody brought up in our community, which I was a little surprised about, was Singles. So Singles, like not a hugely successful Cameron Crowe movie, but there was a lot of music. I mean, like it was about Seattle. It was a romantic kind of comedy set in Seattle, and you had members of Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains that were actually in the movie. They were involved in the creation of the movie. They starred in it. And the soundtrack, again, if we're talking about just indicative of a certain chunk of the 90s, it was Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam and Mother Love Bone and Soundgarden and Mudhoney. I mean, it was just like Screaming Trees. It was just over the plate, everything.
Yeah, it's very 90s.
I have no affinity for it ultimately. But it's almost like, I mean, it's almost like not because the movie didn't take off the way that it could have or should have or whatever. Like it's kind of considered an album, just like a compilation and not even like a soundtrack to an important movie, which is pretty crazy. But yeah, I think that's all the other things. Those were things where I was just like,
worth mentioning.
I don't know if that's going to be on your list or not. So I was like, I'm going to hold off on this.
Yeah. And that's just one, like Singles especially is just like, I know almost nothing about it. It could have the most amazing soundtrack in the world and I just know nothing about it. So it didn't end up on my list for that reason, despite all the research that I did. So, these lists are always, there always has to be a personal component to it. And I think we certainly, if you had to make a time machine of 90s soundtracks, you could do a lot worse than what we came
yeah.
up with if you only
Yeah,
could
yeah.
fit 5 albums in the time capsule.
Yeah.
I think we did pretty well.
Yeah, for
Good
sure.
mix and some good variety in there. But I highly recommend that you watch Godzilla 1998.
I have to watch Godzilla and Pulp Fiction basically, and I need to go rewatch Trainspotting because I've only seen it the one time, and like I
Yeah.
said, I feel like I'd probably appreciate it a lot more now than I did then.
I like Seth's recommendation to do a Tarantino marathon, especially if you haven't seen any of his films.
Yeah,
I mean, honestly, I don't think Pulp Fiction is even near the top of his work, to be honest with you.
right.
I think there are much better Tarantino movies personally, but yeah, I keep going back to it. But if you go into Godzilla with just the idea that, okay, this is not meant to be taken seriously, it's a really enjoyable, slightly hilarious ride. It's indicative of the 90s, I think, that, well,
I'm ready to go.
it wasn't intended to be this what it is. I just don't
Yeah.
know what they were thinking trying to make this like the big blockbuster monster movie, and it's Matthew Broderick, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer. what were they
So
thinking?
weird. Yeah. Yeah, I gotta see
Anyway.
this movie.
Anyway, there's a lot of movies that, you know, ended up that way. But this was a heck of a lot of fun.
It's great.
I love doing these high fives and hashing this stuff out. I think we always come up with some surprising results. And yeah, well, listener, tell us how you think we did, what you agree with, what you disagree with, anything that we completely omitted and neglected to talk about that deserves to be talked about. This is not the end of the discussion of this episode. We can always continue the conversation on Twitter and on the Discord. But thank you so much for listening. We are part of the Retrologic family of podcasts. You can find us on Discord on the Retrologic server, and you can find us on Twitter at retrogroove_pod. Come hit us up and tell us what you think of the episode. And we'll see you next time when we'll find out how Liam enjoyed Godzilla 1998.
It's got to be streaming somewhere.
It definitely is, because we watched it relatively recently.
Awesome.
So yeah, tell us what you think of Godzilla, everybody. I will see you next time.
Later.